Hello humans, it's just Martine, and in today's video I'm going to be reading some of my friends' favorite books from 2023. Every year I tend to do a video where I talk to some of my friends and I get input on some of their favorite books of the year, and I pick one from all of those friends and I read them and I talk about them to you. The main hope for me in doing this in December is that I'll find some new books that I really loved at the end of 2023. So basically all of my friends have vetted these books, loved these books. I'm gonna try them now, and I'll link all their information down below. A disclaimer that I did not necessarily get to pick which book I thought would be the best fit for me from each person's list of their favorites, because I could only go by what was available at my library, and that would arrive to me from my library in the time span of making this video. So it was kind of out of my hands. I just went with what I had available to me. Still, we're gonna get into it. Okay, the first book that I read for this was Lizzie's pick from Lizzie's Literary Life, and the book that I chose for this was Pod, which Lizzie so kindly gifted me for my birthday. She knew that I had been excited for this book for months because both Lizzie and I think Ruby, but definitely Lizzie, read this book months ago when it was shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction this year. And immediately when they described it, I was like, I need to read that now. And my library did not have it at the time. So Ruby told me that this author had written a different book called The Bees, which would maybe satisfy my curiosity for then. And it did, it was so good. But I've still in the back of my mind wanted to read this book so badly because this book is written from the perspective of dolphins. Technically, it is written from the perspective of dolphins and this random fish, but let's ignore that fish for now and talk about the fact that it's written from the perspective of dolphins. I'm going to say unfortunately before my rating, and it's not because I didn't like the book. It's just because I went in with such high expectations that it then did not meet, that I feel bad for the rating that I ended up giving it. But I'm so glad to own this copy, and I think it's such a special book in many different ways. But unfortunately, I am giving it 3.5 stars. Still a good rating, just not everything I wanted it to be and more. I think what hampered this book the most is that I had trouble understanding what was happening in the beginning of the book. Because in the beginning of the book, we are introduced to various different characters. We are introduced to Ia, we are introduced to Google, and then we are introduced to somebody else, another dolphin, and then we are also introduced to the wrasse, which is a fish, and all four of these perspectives are taking place in different parts of the ocean. And you know that hopefully the stories are going to merge eventually, but before they do, as you're trying to keep your head in four different places, it was just too much for me. I also think, although it was a nice little nugget at one point in the story, having the perspective of the wrasse in general was unnecessary and confusing. I don't feel like that character played as much of a role in the climax of the story as I wanted them to if we were going to spend so much time with them. So I just think it made it hard to get into, but I really enjoyed like the ending of the book, and I think this would be better upon reread for me because I would have in mind where we're going with it. And I do think that's a bad sign for the book because I don't think you should have to have that foreknowledge to fully appreciate the beginning of a book, although it's always nice to look back and see how foreshadowing was made. But I do think there's a difference between going back and seeing like small little things before versus going back and being able to understand. And I do feel like I'd understand it a lot better now that I've read the ending, which is one of the reasons I'm so grateful that Lizzie gifted me this book, because now I can reread it at my leisure anytime I want, forever and ever and always. And it was also the first book that I got to stamp with my new From the Library of Martine, and then it has my last name in it to show that this is my book now. So Lizzie, thank you. What an exciting thing. A friend gifted me the stamp, another friend gifted me the book. I stamped the stamp on this book first. So this will always be a very special book to me for many reasons. At its core, all you really need to know going into this is that it's written from the perspective of dolphins. But if you want to know a little bit more about the plot going in, then I'll tell you that largely we're following this one dolphin, Ia, and she has been different, not like other girls in her clan of dolphins for a very long time. She's felt out of place, and then some events conspire to drive her away from her group of dolphins, and she kind of goes it on her own in the ocean, and the story kind of goes from there. So at its core, it is kind of a book about like belonging, how different societies are constructed, but also it is a book about like climate change. It is a piece of climate fiction technically. And so it has messages about like the ocean and how disgusting the ocean has become because humanity has treated the ocean like a huge dumping ground. So we see some of the personal effects of that on the dolphins in this book, and for that I really appreciate it. I also think I had to rate this a 3.5 because I enjoyed it slightly less than The Bees. That read a lot more like a thriller, and this one was maybe less exciting for me in times. Overall, this was a really fun first read for this, and I'm so grateful to Lizzie for making sure that this was my pick for this by sending me this book. But it just didn't hit all the notes I initially wanted it to. Although I will say it's been a couple days since I finished this now. As I continue to sit with it, I like it more and more, which is rare for me because usually I sit with a book and like it less and less. But this one has stayed in my noggin pretty prevalently for the last few days. So there is that. Onwards and upwards. Hello, I am here to deliver a very exciting success story for this video, and that's because I finished reading my pick for Bailey's favorites of the year, and for this I chose Wolf Song by TJ Klune, and I loved it. I gave it 5 stars. This one had me kicking my feet the whole time, just a little giggle. I loved the characters. I'm so excited for the rest of the series, although I am sad that the rest of the series focuses on other characters. I'm sure I'll love them just as much, but there was something that I really loved about this set of main characters. It was just so good. The only way I can describe it is that it was so good. And it was something that I was kind of nervous going into because I knew that it was a werewolf story. I'm not typically one for like a paranormal, especially a paranormal romance situation, but this one was like werewolves done well, and I just so thoroughly loved it. In this one, we're following Ox, and his dad left when he was young. He's on his own with his mom in this house, and then one day this family moves in down the street. They take him in pretty immediately, like he goes over there all the time to hang out and to have dinner. The family's a little bit weird, and we discover why later, and things kind of go from there. It's both the most incredible found family situation, which TJ Klune is always so good at writing, and then also like high stakes, adventure-y. My heart hurt so badly at times during this, and it was so full during others, and it was just every possible emotion that I could feel. And it was just wonderful. It was just so good. So thank you, Bailey, for making me get around to this one, because I was seriously so skeptical about it that I considered never reading it, even though I've loved other TJ Klune books, just because I knew it was like more the type of book that I had a bigger chance of not liking, but TJ Klune delivered, so yay. Hello, I'm here to make my report because I finished reading my pick for Danielle's favorites of the year, and for this I went with It's Lonely at the Center of the Earth, which is an autobiographical graphic novel, and I'm giving it 2.5 stars, which is slightly disappointing but not all that surprising because Danielle and I often like different books, and I can totally see why Danielle loved this book because it has Danielle written all over it. Like the art style, I can see why she liked. Some of the like pacing and plotting, I can see how she loved, but it was not exactly to my taste. It was still like a pretty good time, an interesting story, a resonant story about mental health, but I'm just so bad at getting graphic novels. So I had a really hard time with the various forms that the author used and all of those things, but I'm glad I gave it a try. And we have another book down for this. Hooray. Howdy. For Ruby's pick, I read What My Bones Know by Stephanie Fu, which is partially like a memoir, partially a journalistic approach to her experience with complex PTSD, and I'm giving it 5 stars. One of the reasons I really love studying psychology is because it's always changing. Like, humans are so hard to understand, so we're always learning new things in psychology. And trauma is one of those things that psychology has been really bad at understanding. Every other field has also been really bad at understanding trauma, and it shows. And the discussions that the author has in this book show how like there's still a lot of crazy stuff out there. For instance, when she has conversations with her doctor and she says, oh, maybe it's because I have complex PTSD, and she goes, that's not related at all. But like, your mental health is related to your physical health. And like, some treatments that people used to recommend in the past for dealing with PTSD, it turns out like they're either not helpful or really bad for some people with PTSD. And so trauma is this really, really complicated thing. It's also hard to study because like you cannot randomly assign trauma and everybody's trauma is so different. It's all just a lot. So I really appreciated this view of one person's experience with CPTSD. I found it very enlightening. It did affirm lots of things that I already know about trauma, but I did also learn some new things, and it was super fascinating, especially the section where we hear from her most recent and most helpful therapist and all of those things. So I just found it so enlightening and life-giving and all of those things. So it was definitely a difficult read at times, but overall I think it's very worth it read, at least it was to me. So thank you to Ruby for making me read this. Oh, side note, this was also a very helpful book for me to read because I do a lot of projects about trauma in my graduate research track, and so learning new things about trauma is always very important for me, but one thing that's even more important than always learning new things is always hearing other people's experiences and hearing about them and their lives and their behaviors. That's the most helpful, and it reminds me the reason why I do the work that I do. So that's another reason that I loved this book. All right, now it's the end of the review. Hello there, I am here to report what happened with Kayla's read, which was Her Night with the Duke by Diana Quincy. Now, this was on Bailey's list last year, and I didn't read it last year because I didn't have it available to me at the time. And now it's on Kayla's list, so it has double approval. So I was like, what the heck, I'll read it because I got access to it. And I'm giving it 3 stars. This was fun for what it was, but what it was something that was really not my style. You can tell from the title, and you could have told from the synopsis if only I'd read the synopsis, but no, I was like, this book has double approval, I'm reading it. Again, it was 3 stars, it wasn't bad. It was fun for what it was, but what it was just wasn't for me. And that's because this book is about this countess, and she has a one-night stand with this duke, and they don't realize who the other is and that it's like a person of importance. They just have this one-night stand and then they leave each other forever. And then of course that's not how it goes because that would be a boring book. They in fact run into each other because the Duke is going to be betrothed to the stepdaughter of the Countess. So things get awk and they have to figure it out. Listen, I like a slow burn. I don't like a chapter 2 and 3 and 4 let's get to it type thing. And there were plenty of scenes like that in subsequent chapters, which is fine for people who like those scenes. I'm just not that person. That was a little unfortunate because I didn't understand the connection between the characters. Like I understood that they were attracted to each other, but I for one didn't really get their chemistry. They had no emotional intimacy, I felt, that would lead to them making sense in a long-term situation. Regardless, it was scandalous and fun and all that stuff. Not my fave historical romance, but a pretty good time. Hello, I am here to deliver my review of Ashley's pick, which is Nightbirds. It's a fantasy, I think it's a YA fantasy, and I'm giving it 3 stars. So pretty enjoyable for a fantasy book for me. In this one, we're following these 3 girls. They have these magical powers and they are the Nightbirds. Nightbirds can share their magical powers with other people. They cannot use them themselves, but they can give them to other people. And so they sell that. And so we're following them as some political intrigue happens as some people are targeting the Nightbirds. Overall, I found the magic system really interesting. I found the world building pretty interesting, but at the midway through the end point, it was just way too much action for me, and I didn't really care about the characters. That's on that. And that's my whole review of that book. Fun, but nothing huge. Hello, I'm here to talk about the final book that I read for this video and then walk you through the results of the whole thing. So for Adriana from Carbon Bonded Books pick, I read The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin. And the reason that I picked this is because I've been wanting to read this book for years. It is a fundamental piece of classic sci-fi literature, and particularly one of the classics that focuses and challenges our conceptions of gender, which I find interesting. So I read it and I'm giving it 3.5 stars. So I still had a pretty good time with it. I just think I did have a lot of difficulty with some of the choices, not only in ways that I'll discuss about history and all that stuff, but also just in terms of the plot and stuff. And that's probably because it's technically the 4th book in a series. You don't have to for the rest of the series, but as Adriana said when she reviewed it, it probably would have been beneficial in some ways to have read the previous ones. But I think largely the reason it didn't get higher than a 3.5 stars for me is because I do research on gender and gender nonconformity and stuff, and I see all of that stuff from the perspective of how things are and what we know today. And I think when you look back on history, the changes that are made seem small. But when you look forward in history and history is being made, at the time it was written, it was a big change and a big deal. But because we've progressed in the ways that we have, it looks small when you look back. And so like there's this quote that I found in an article that says, "The Left Hand of Darkness is one of those books that changed the world, so that reading it now in the world it helped grow, it isn't possible to have the same experience as reading it in the world it was written in and for." And so I think it was written in what, the 60s, and like even though we have major issues with the way that we discuss and handle gender even to this day, it is not nearly the same way that we handled gender in the 60s. And so you read a book that was like radical at the time and you want it to be radical and life-changing for you, but it isn't because you're looking the opposite way in history. Especially because I've read lots of modern science fiction that has challenged our conceptions of gender. The modern fiction does it in ways that Ursula K. Le Guin was not willing to, not because she didn't think about it in that way, but because she thought that society wasn't ready to hear it that way. And as my major professor always reminds me, you have to give in some ways so that both sides are willing to listen, because you can never get your message across if people just block you out. So one example of that is that Ursula K. Le Guin used default pronouns of he and him for this androgynous species that was at like the center of this book, instead of like they, them, neopronouns. And the problem with that is that we have been taught in our society that the pronouns he, him are masculine. And that, as much as we can try not to, gives us some idea about the character that we're reading about. It was hard to read and not think male when they used he, him pronouns for this more non-binary agender species. And there was also some terminology that was like not correct about it. Like she kept calling this species bisexual. And I suppose they were in some ways, but not the way she meant, because she was using that to refer to gender, but that is a sexual orientation instead of a gender orientation, which again, our knowledge and explanations of that have changed and fluctuated so much since this has been written. It's perfectly understandable that she did that. It just made it really hard as a modern reader going in. Reading it can feel like a step backwards at times because it is older ideas, so it's just hard. But in this one, we're following this envoy from this one place in space, and he's visiting this planet that has this species, and they are typically androgynous until it is time to mate, and then they basically reflect whatever gender is opposite of their partners at the time. It's basically a political book where this envoy is trying to like bridge a connection between where he is from and this world, and so we're seeing the complications with that. But the main purpose of it is to introduce this species that like challenges gender in this way. And I definitely thought it was interesting, and I can definitely see how some of the modern works I read now have definitely been influenced by this work, and I'm really glad that I finally got around to reading it. It's just really hard to read work looking backwards. That's on that. And with that, I've finished all 7 books for this video. From lowest rated to highest rated, I read It's Lonely at the Center of the Earth, which I gave 2.5 stars, and that was Danielle's pick. I read Nightbirds, which I gave 3 stars, that was Ashley's pick. I read Her Night with the Duke, which I gave 3 stars, that was Kayla's pick. I read The Left Hand of Darkness, which I gave 3.5 stars, and that was Adriana's pick. I read Pod, which I gave 3.5 stars, that was Lizzie's pick. I read What My Bones Know, which I gave 5 stars, and that was Ruby's pick. And I read Wolf Song, which I gave 5 stars, and that was Bailey's pick. Thank you so much to my friends, one, for just being you, but also for sharing all your favorite reads with me so that I could get a taste of what your reading year has been like. And thank you so much to you for watching. If you like this video, go ahead and give it a big thumbs up and comment down below what has one of your favorite books from this year been, and subscribe for more reading, writing, and college lifestyle content. And until next time, bye humans, bye!